In March of 1948, when the snow finally began to melt in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, two hikers discovered something impossible. They found a cave with a wooden door. Inside, the air was warm, and sitting by a small fire, roasting rabbit meat over carefully arranged stones, were two girls. One was 15, the other was 7. They had been there all winter, alone. No one believed their story. Not at first. Not until they saw what was inside that cave. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the cave, before the snow, before everything fell apart, there was a farmhouse at the edge of the world. And there was a woman named Astrid Hollis who knew that winter was coming long before the first flake fell. The farmhouse sat where the valley ended and the mountains began. Beyond the wooden fence, the land rolled upward into pine forests and granite peaks that scraped the bottoms of clouds. The nearest town was 11 miles east along a dirt road that turned to mud every spring and ice every winter. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles south across a creek that flooded in April and froze solid by November. Nessa Hollis stood on the porch watching her grandmother hang laundry on the line. The sheets billowed like sails in the mountain wind. Astrid Hollis was 72 years old, but she moved with the efficiency of someone who had never learned how to rest. Her hands were rough from decades of work, cracked at the knuckles, stained with soil that never fully washed away. Her eyes were the pale blue of glacial ice, the kind of blue that came from generations of people who had stared down Norwegian winters and refused to look away. She had come to Montana from a village outside Bergen in 1902, a young bride following a husband who dreamed of gold. The gold never came. The husband died in a mining accident 7 years later, crushed under a timber support in a shaft that should have been reinforced months before. But Astrid stayed. She raised her daughter on this land, learned to work it alone, learned to read the weather in the color of the sky and the direction of the wind. And when that daughter died in a landslide, along with her husband 2 years ago, Astrid took in her 2 granddaughters without a single moment of hesitation. Nessa was 13 then. Ren was 5. Now Nessa was 15, tall for her age, with dark hair she kept in a single braid down her back. She had her mother's face, but her grandmother's watchfulness. Eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She rarely smiled. She rarely spoke more than necessary, but she watched everything. She remembered everything. And that habit of remembering would save her life. Ren was the opposite in every way. 7 years old and made entirely of sunshine and motion. She had curly brown hair that escaped every braid within the hour. She talked to everything she encountered, the chickens in the yard, the aspen trees along the fence, the fat gray clouds that drifted over the mountain like slow ships. She drew pictures constantly, filling scraps of paper and the margins of old newspapers with animals and flowers and the granite peak that rose behind their home. Astrid called from the yard. Nessa stepped off the porch and crossed the grass to help with the sheets. The wind tugged at her dress and pressed cold fingers against her neck. She could smell snow coming, even though the sky was still blue. There was a metallic edge to the air, a sharpness that bit the inside of her nose. She mentioned the storm she sensed. Astrid nodded. The first real one of the season, she said. The aspens had been warning them for days. Their leaves had gone from gold to brown overnight, and half of them had already fallen, which meant the trees were pulling their energy inward, bracing for what was coming. They worked together in comfortable silence, folding the sheets into neat squares that smelled of wind and pine. This was one of the things Nessa loved most about her grandmother. She never felt the need to fill every quiet moment with words. Some people talked because they were afraid of silence. Astrid understood that silence was where you learned to listen. Then she spoke. She told Nessa about her grandfather. He had survived 47 days in a snow cave once in the mountains above Bergen. He was 19 years old, alone. No supplies except a knife, a length of rope, and a brass lighter his father had given him. Nessa had heard this story before, many times, but she never tired of it. She asked how he managed. Knowledge, Astrid said. Preparation. Stubbornness. She smiled, just slightly, the way she did when she was remembering something that was both painful and precious. He always said the mountain wasn't trying to kill him. The mountain didn't care one way or another. It was just being a mountain. The difference between living and dying was understanding that. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A Zippo lighter. Its brass surface was worn almost smooth from decades of handling, the original engraving barely visible. This was his, Astrid said. He carried it through 2 winters in the Norwegian wilderness. He gave it to me on our wedding day, said it was the most valuable thing he owned, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it could do. She pressed it into Nessa's palm. Now it belongs to you. The lighter was warm from her grandmother's body heat. Nessa closed her fingers around it and felt the weight of it, heavier than she expected for something so small. She asked why Astrid was giving it to her now. Astrid's eyes drifted toward the mountain. The peak was catching the last of the afternoon light, glowing orange against the darkening sky. Because knowledge should be passed down, she said. Because you are old enough to carry its weight. And because the first snow is coming. And I want you to remember what I have taught you. She cupped Nessa's face in her rough hands. Her palms were warm and calloused and smelled of lavender soap. Fire is life, child. Never forget that. That night, the storm arrived. Snow fell thick and heavy, piling against the windows, burying the fence posts, turning the world into a single shade of white. Inside the farmhouse, the fire crackled in the stone hearth. Ren drew pictures by lamplight, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she was concentrating. Nessa read a book about frontier survival. Astrid sat in her rocking chair, knitting a scarf from dark blue wool. The needles clicked in a steady rhythm, soft as a heartbeat. At some point during the night, those hands went still. Nessa found her in the morning, the knitting needles still clutched in her fingers, the scarf half finished across her lap, her face peaceful, as if she had simply decided to stop, the way you stop at the end of a long day's work and sit down and close your eyes. The doctor said it was her heart, quick and painless. A good death, he called it. But there is no such thing as a good death when you are 15 years old, and the woman who raised you is gone, and the snow is still falling, and you don't know what comes next. Ren cried for 3 days. Nessa did not cry at all. She was too busy being strong, because there was no one else to be strong for them. She made arrangements. She answered questions from the sheriff and the preacher and the county clerk. She accepted condolences from neighbors who had barely spoken to them in 2 years. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The ground was too frozen for burial, so they placed the casket in the church cellar until spring. 7 people attended: the preacher, the doctor, a few neighbors who stood at the back and left before the final prayer, and 1 stranger. A woman stepped out of a black automobile just as the service ended, thin, sharp-featured, dressed in a wool coat and leather gloves that cost more than anything in that church. Her eyes were the same pale blue as Astrid's, but the warmth had been stripped from them. They were eyes that measured and calculated and found everything slightly beneath their standards. She introduced herself as Cordell Pratt, their mother's older sister, their aunt. Ren pressed against Nessa's side, suddenly shy. Cordell spoke of old differences with their grandmother, ancient arguments about money and land and choices made decades ago. But that was water under the bridge, she said. What mattered now was that the girls had family, and family takes care of its own. Her lips curved upward. Her eyes did not. Nessa wanted to argue. She wanted to say the farm was their home, and their grandmother had left it to them, and they didn't need anyone's help. But she was 15. The law required an adult guardian. Without one, she and Ren would be separated and placed in county orphanages on opposite ends of Montana. At least with Cordell, they would stay together. She agreed quietly. She did not notice the way Cordell's gaze lingered on the farmhouse as they drove away. The way her eyes swept across the acreage, the barn, the fields, the mountain timber beyond. Counting, pricing, adding it all up. The house in Missoula was large and airless, not cold in temperature. The radiators hissed and clanked through the night, but cold in the way an empty church is cold. The furniture was dark and heavy. The curtains stayed drawn against the daylight. Silence filled the rooms like water filling a jar, pressing against the walls, rising higher each day. The first week, Cordell performed kindness like an actress learning her lines. New dresses, school enrollment, introductions to neighbors. "My beloved nieces," she told them, touching Ren's curls with fingers that pulled just slightly too hard. But Nessa saw through it. She noticed the smiles that vanished the instant they were alone. The dinner plates with portions that wouldn't satisfy a cat. The way Cordell looked at them sometimes across the dining table with an expression of tight irritation, as though they were stains on expensive fabric that refused to come out. By the second week, the performance was over. Cordell handed Nessa a list of chores that would have broken a grown man's back. Scrub every floor, wash every window, cook every meal, and clean up after. Ren mended clothes and polished silver until her small fingers cramped and ached. One night, curled together in the narrow bed they shared, Ren whispered into the dark, "Why is she so mean to us?" Nessa pulled her closer. "I don't know," she said. But she was beginning to understand. One evening, while Cordell attended a dinner party, Nessa searched the study. The desk drawer was locked, but the lock was cheap and old. She found a letter from a lawyer dated 2 weeks before Astrid's death. According to the will, the farm and all savings, $4,200, would be held in trust for Nessa until she turned 18. Cordell had no legal claim to any of it, but attached to the letter was a second document. Cordell had written to the lawyer asking about the process for declaring the girls wards of the state. If guardianship transferred to the county, the farm could be sold to cover institutional care costs, and Cordell, as the only living relative, would be first in line to purchase it. Nessa put the letter back exactly where she found it. Her hands were shaking. Everything made sense now. The funeral appearance, the practiced kindness, the slow starvation. Cordell didn't want nieces. She wanted the land. 3 months ground past. Winter deepened. The work grew harder. The food grew scarcer. Ren's drawings changed. No more animals and flowers. Now she drew storms, shadows, doors with heavy locks. Nessa watched her sister disappearing into herself and felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't name. Then, on a morning in early December, Cordell woke them before dawn. "Get dressed." They were taking a trip. "A boarding school in the mountains," she said. "Very exclusive." "Other children," Cordell added, and something flickered across her face. That same flat emptiness that Nessa had learned to recognize as danger. They climbed into the wagon, Cordell driving, the girls huddled under a thin blanket in the back. The road wound through the valley, then began climbing into the mountains. Snow dusted the pine trees. The sky hung low and gray like a ceiling pressing down. Ren fell asleep against Nessa's shoulder, her breath warm and steady. Nessa stayed awake. She watched the road. She memorized landmarks: a split boulder, a lightning-struck pine, a creek crossing where the ice was thin enough to see the water moving underneath. Her grandmother's voice whispered in the back of her mind, "Pay attention. Always pay attention." The road narrowed. The trees closed in. At some point, Nessa realized they had left the main road. They were following a rough track through deep wilderness. No signs, no wheel marks, no indication anyone had passed this way in weeks. She asked where the school was. Cordell did not answer. The wagon stopped in a clearing between 2 steep ridges. Snow was falling now, soft and steady, covering everything white. Cordell told them to get out. Nessa's heart began hammering against her ribs. Cordell tossed a small bundle at their feet. 2 pieces of dry bread. A half-empty bottle of water. Then she climbed back onto the wagon and took up the reins. Nessa called after her. "Where are you going?" Cordell didn't turn around. "I'll be back," she said. "Stay right there." She snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Nessa grabbed Ren's hand and chased it, calling out, begging her to stop. But the wagon picked up speed. It rounded a bend in the track and disappeared into the falling snow. The sound of hooves and wheels faded. Then there was nothing. Just the soft hiss of snowflakes landing on pine branches and the ragged sound of Nessa's own breathing. The wagon tracks were filling in, smoothing over, vanishing. Ren's voice was very small. "Is she coming back?" Nessa stared at the empty road for a long time. The cold was settling into her bones. The truth was settling into her mind. "No," she said. "She's not." Ren asked what they had done wrong. The question broke something open inside Nessa's chest. She knelt in the snow and pulled her sister close and held her while she sobbed. "Nothing," Nessa said. "We didn't do anything wrong. She wants the farm. She wants the money. And she doesn't want us in the way." Ren said they would die out here. The words hung between them in the frozen air, visible as breath, heavy as stone. Nessa looked around. White wilderness in every direction. Gray sky pressing down. Snow already covering their shoes. Her sister was right. This was a death sentence. Cordell Pratt had driven 2 children into the mountains and left them to freeze. But Nessa was Astrid Hollis's granddaughter, and her grandfather had survived 47 days. "No," she said. "We won't." She made herself think. Panic was the enemy. Panic made you run in circles. It made you stupid. It burned energy you could not afford to waste. Astrid had drilled that into her since she was old enough to walk in the woods alone. "Fear is natural," her grandmother used to say. "Panic is a choice. Choose something else. Shelter first. South-facing if possible. Protected from the north wind." A cave was ideal. She scanned the ridges on either side of the clearing. The western ridge was steep and rocky, scarred with dark crevices and overhangs. There might be caves. It was their only chance. She told Ren they were going to walk. Just a little way. "Can you do that?" Ren nodded through her tears. Nessa squeezed her hand. "You're brave," she said. "Hold on to me and don't let go." They climbed. The snow was ankle deep and getting deeper with every step. Nessa's boots soaked through in minutes. Her fingers went numb inside thin gloves. But she kept moving, kept scanning the rock face above them for any break, any shadow, any darkness that might mean shelter. Ren stumbled twice. The second time she couldn't get up. She said she couldn't feel her feet. Nessa lifted her onto her back and kept climbing. Her sister weighed almost nothing. All bones and thin clothes. 3 months of Cordell's starvation had hollowed her out. Then she saw it. A shadow in the cliff face, darker than the surrounding stone, half hidden by hanging roots and a drift of snow. A gap, a cave. "Almost there," she told Ren. "Just a little more." The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for Nessa to squeeze through sideways with Ren still clinging to her back. Inside it opened into a space roughly 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. Low ceiling, maybe 5 feet at the highest point. The floor was rocky, covered with old leaves and dry pine needles. It was dark. It smelled of earth and damp stone and something older than either. But the wind could not reach them here. She set Ren down gently and gathered what she could find. Leaves, needles, twigs that had blown into the entrance over months or years. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold them. She built a small pile near the back wall where a crack in the ceiling might let smoke escape. Then she reached into her coat pocket. The Zippo was cold against her fingers. She could feel the worn brass, the faint grooves where the engraving used to be. She flicked it once. Nothing. Again. A spark, but no flame. Her thumb was numb. She could barely feel the wheel. Again. The flame jumped to life. Tiny. Fragile. A single point of orange light trembling in the darkness of that cave. She cupped her hand around it and held it to the tinder. Smoke rose. The leaves curled and blackened. And then fire. Real fire. Crackling and spreading through the dry needles, throwing shadows that leaped and danced along the stone walls. Ren stared at the flame with wide eyes. "You made fire," she whispered. Nessa fed it carefully, a twig at a time. Too much would smother it. Too little would let it die. The warmth reached them slowly, creeping outward like something alive, pressing back the cold inch by inch. She wrapped Ren in her own coat and pulled her close against her chest. Outside, the storm kept falling. The light at the cave entrance dimmed as snow piled higher. Inside, the fire painted the walls in shades of amber and gold. Ren pressed her face against Nessa's shoulder. Her body was still trembling, but the shaking was slowing. After a long silence, she spoke. "Are we going to die?" The question was quiet, honest, the kind of question only a child can ask because they haven't yet learned to dress fear up in polite language. Nessa tightened her arms. "No," she said. "Grandfather survived 47 days in a cave, just like this one. We can do this." She didn't know if it was true. She was 15 years old, sitting in a hole in a mountain with a dying fire, and a 7-year-old sister and 2 pieces of bread, and no idea if anyone in the world knew they were here. But Ren needed to believe it, and somehow, in that moment, holding her sister in the dark while the fire crackled and the snow whispered against the stone outside, Nessa believed it too. That decision, that single stubborn refusal to surrender, would carry them through 94 days in the wilderness, through starvation and sickness, and the worst blizzard Montana had seen in 50 years, through nights so cold that metal turned brittle and exposed skin frozen under a minute. But all of that was still ahead of them. On that first night, there was only the fire, only 2 sisters in a cave, only the sound of Ren's breathing growing steady and slow as sleep finally pulled her under. Nessa sat awake in the dark, feeding the flame 1 twig at a time, and made a promise to the grandmother she would never see again. "I'll keep the fire burning, I promise." Morning came without color. The light that crept into the cave was thin and gray, as though the world outside had forgotten how to be bright. Snow had piled higher against the entrance during the night, narrowing the opening to a sliver barely wide enough to let air pass through. The wind had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any sound. Nessa woke with her arms numb and her legs stiff as wood. Ren was curled against her side, face pale, lips dry and slightly cracked. For one terrible moment, Nessa forgot where they were. Then the cold reminded her. It always would. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake her sister too fast. The fire had burned down to a dull ring of red coals, barely breathing. She added 2 thin branches and blew gently until a small flame returned, weak but alive. She would learn in the coming weeks that this was the most dangerous hour, the time between the fire dying and the fire coming back. Everything depended on those few minutes. She stepped to the edge of the cave and looked out. The road was gone. Snow covered everything in every direction, smooth and white and unbroken. No tracks, no sign that a wagon had ever passed through this clearing, just hills and trees and the long gray slope of rock rising behind them. The world had erased Cordell Pratt as thoroughly as Cordell had tried to erase them. Ren stirred. She asked if it was morning. Nessa said yes. They had made it through the night. Ren pushed herself up on thin arms and hugged her knees. She asked if someone would find them today. Her voice was steady, no tears, just a question. Nessa didn't answer right away. She walked back inside and handed Ren the water bottle. Ren took small, careful sips the way Nessa had taught her the night before. Waste nothing. Every drop matters. Then Ren said it quietly, almost to herself. "No one is coming." "No," Nessa agreed. "No one is coming." Ren nodded once. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at the fire and nodded. That silence frightened Nessa more than any tears would have. She tore 1 piece of bread in half and gave Ren the larger portion. "Eat first," she said. Ren told her she needed to eat too. Nessa said she would eat after. They both knew There was almost nothing left to eat after. That first day, Nessa began transforming the cave into something more than a hole in the rock. She worked from memory alone, pulling up every lesson Astrid had ever taught her about the old ways, the Norwegian ways, knowledge passed down through generations of people who lived in places where winter could kill you in an hour if you stopped paying attention. First, the wind wall. She gathered 47 branches, each between 2 and 4 feet long, snapping them over her knee until her palms were raw and bleeding. She wedged them into the cave entrance at a 60-degree angle, creating a barrier 8 feet wide and 5 feet tall. Then she packed the gaps with snow, pressing it tight with her fists until it hardened into ice, and stuffed the remaining spaces with pine needles and dead leaves. The temperature inside the cave rose within the hour. Not warm, but survivable. The difference between those two words was the difference between life and death. Next, the sleeping platform. The ground was the real enemy at night. Cold seeped up through stone and earth, stealing body heat faster than the air ever could. Nessa stacked flat rocks into a low platform 18 inches high and covered it with layers of pine branches and dry leaves. That night, when Ren lay down, she didn't shiver as badly. Her body wasn't pressed against frozen ground anymore. 18 inches of dead air between her and the earth. It was enough. The days blurred together in those first weeks. Nessa fell into a rhythm of survival that left no room for grief or fear or anything except the next task. Every morning she rebuilt the fire, checked the wind wall for gaps, melted snow for water in a dented metal cup she found wedged in a crack at the back of the cave, left behind by some traveler whose name she would soon discover. Every afternoon, she ventured out to gather firewood. She learned which wood burned fast and which burned slow. Pine caught quickly, but was gone in minutes. Oak burned for hours, but was stubborn to light. She needed both. But food was the crisis. The bread was gone after the second day. Hunger came in waves at first, sharp and nauseating. Then it settled into a dull, constant ache that lived behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. On the fourth day, she remembered something Astrid had told her on an autumn walk through the woods. Animals leave stories in the snow. If you know how to read them, they will show you where to find food. Nessa studied the ground outside the cave. Small prints in pairs, little jumps between them. Rabbits. She felt something spark inside her chest. She shaped thin wire from a broken buckle on her shoe into a loop. A snare. Simple but precise. A noose with a 4-inch diameter positioned 3 inches above the ground along a rabbit run, held open by a bent stick. The first snare caught nothing. The second collapsed in the wind. The third disappeared under drifting snow. But on the 5th day, she found a rabbit tangled in one of her traps, still alive, kicking weakly, eyes wide and black. Nessa felt sick. She whispered an apology. Then she did what had to be done, because her sister was hungry, and hunger doesn't wait for you to feel ready. They cooked the meat over the fire that night. The smell filled the cave thick and rich and real. They ate in silence, slowly. And when they were finished, Ren looked at Nessa with something that had been missing from her face for weeks. She smiled. "You're good at this," she said. Nessa shook her head. "I'm not good at it. I'm just trying." On the 12th day, Nessa made a discovery that changed everything. She had been exploring the back of the cave, looking for better ventilation when her hand brushed against marks on the wall. She brought a burning stick closer and caught her breath. Drawings, carved into the stone. Ancient figures of people and animals and flames. And below them, newer marks scratched more recently into the rock. Wedged into a crack beneath the drawings was a small metal box, rusted but intact. Nessa pried it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a leather journal, brittle yellow pages covered in careful handwriting. January 1889, day 23, temperature 31 below zero. The cave holds warmth better than I expected. I built the wind barrier at 60 degrees as my father taught me. The gap between stones and branches creates dead air space. Dead air does not conduct heat. I believe I will survive. Signed, E. Brennan. Nessa sat down hard, the journal in her lap. Someone else had been here. Someone else had survived this same cave, this same kind of winter, nearly 60 years before her. She read the entire journal that night while Ren slept. Edmund Brennan had been a fur trapper caught in a blizzard in the winter of 1889. He spent 41 days in this cave before spring thaw allowed him to walk out. He had documented everything: how to position the fire for maximum heat, which plants were safe to eat when the snow pulled back, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals and the feel of the air on your skin. Page after page of survival knowledge written by a man who had looked death in the face and chosen to keep writing. It was like receiving a letter from someone who had known she was coming, a gift left in the dark by a stranger who understood exactly what she would need. Ren woke and asked what she was reading. Nessa showed her the journal. She said someone else had lived in this cave a long time ago. He survived, and he left instructions for whoever came next. Ren's eyes went wide. Does that mean we'll survive too? Nessa looked at the careful handwriting, at the diagrams and measurements, at the small map Brennan had drawn of the surrounding area. Yes, she said, I think it does. The night ghost arrived. Nessa thought they were going to die. It was the third week. A storm had come in fast. The worst yet. Wind tore at the entrance, forcing snow through every gap in the wall. The fire guttered twice and nearly went out. Ren was crying, shaking with fear and cold. Nessa held her tight and tried to shield her from the worst of it, but her own teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. Then she heard scratching at the entrance, something pushing against the wind wall. Nessa grabbed the stone knife she had made from a piece of flint. She pushed Ren behind her and faced the entrance. The wall shifted. A shape squeezed through the gap. A dog, or something like a dog. Larger than any she had seen, with thick gray fur matted with ice and pale yellow eyes that caught the firelight. A wolf-dog hybrid, half wild, half something else. The animal stopped just inside the entrance. It was thin, ribs showing through its coat, ears flat against its head. It wasn't growling. It was shaking. Ren peered out from behind Nessa. It's scared, she whispered. Nessa didn't lower the knife. She watched the animal for a long time. It sank to the ground and laid its head on its paws. Those strange pale eyes watched them, but it made no move forward. The truth came to her slowly. This creature wasn't hunting. It was doing exactly what they had done, seeking shelter from something that wanted to kill it. She reached for a piece of rabbit meat from their small store, and tossed it toward the wolf dog. The animal sniffed once and swallowed it whole. Then it stayed. When the storm passed the next morning, Nessa expected the creature to leave. It didn't. It followed her when she checked the snares. It lay near the fire at night, adding its warmth to the small space. It growled softly at sounds from the forest that Nessa couldn't hear yet. And it positioned itself between Ren and the cave entrance every time they slept. Ren named it Ghost because it had appeared out of the storm like something not quite real. Nessa didn't trust it at first. Wild things were wild. Her grandmother had always said you couldn't tame the wilderness out of a creature that was born to it. But as the days passed, she noticed things. The way ghosts' ears would flatten minutes before a storm arrived, giving them time to prepare. The way Ren's nightmares stopped when she slept curled against the animal's warm side. And she noticed something else, something she didn't understand yet. Around Ghost's neck, nearly hidden by matted fur, was a leather collar, old and cracked and stiff with age, and carved into the leather, barely legible, was a name, Brennan. This animal wasn't wild. It had belonged to someone with the same name as the man who had written the journal 60 years ago. That didn't make sense. The journal was from 1889. No dog lived that long. But the collar was real, and the name was clear, and Nessa added it to the growing list of questions she couldn't answer. Not yet. The 8th week was when she almost lost Ren. It started with a cough. A small sound, barely there. Nessa didn't think much of it. But the cough returned the next day, and the day after that, it was worse. By the 4th day, Ren was burning with fever. Nessa had survived cold. She had survived hunger. She had survived the knowledge that their own blood had left them to freeze. But nothing terrified her like watching her sister's body shake with chills while her skin burned hot under Nessa's palm. Ren's chest rattled when she breathed. Her eyes went glassy and unfocused. She stopped eating. She stopped talking. She stopped drawing. She just lay on the pine branch bed, getting smaller by the hour. There was no medicine, no doctor, no help of any kind. Just a cave and a fire and knowledge that suddenly felt like nothing at all. Nessa remembered her grandmother making bone broth for a sick neighbor once. Something in the marrow that fights infection, Astrid had said. Nessa crushed every rabbit bone she had saved and boiled them for 4 hours in the metal cup, creating a thin, greasy liquid that smelled like the earth itself. She lifted Ren's head and dribbled it into her mouth, drop by drop. Most of it ran back out down her chin. Ghost would not leave Ren's side. The wolf dog pressed against her body, sharing heat, licking her face whenever she whimpered, as if it understood what was happening, as if it had made the same choice Nessa had made that first night in the cave. Stay. Don't give up. Keep the warmth going. That night, Nessa did not sleep. She sat by the fire watching her sister's chest rise and fall, counting each breath because she was afraid that if she stopped counting, the breathing would stop too. The fire crackled. The wind moaned through the cracks in the wall. The shadows moved across the ceiling like slow, dark water. She found herself talking out loud, even though no one could hear. "Grandmother," she whispered, "I don't know what to do. Please help me." No answer came. Just the sound of Ren's shallow breathing and the wind and the fire. Nessa put her head in her hands. And for the first time since Cordell had driven away and left them in the snow, she cried. Not quiet tears. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body and echoed off the stone walls. All the fear she had held back, all the grief she had swallowed, all the rage at Cordell and at the world and at whatever God had decided that two girls who had already lost everything should lose even more. Then Ren's voice broke through the darkness. Small, weak, but real. Nessa, don't cry. Ghost is keeping me warm. Nessa's head snapped up. Ren's eyes were open, still glassy with fever, but open, aware, looking at her sister with an expression that no 7-year-old should have to wear. An expression that said, I am still here. Don't give up on me. Nessa scrambled to her side and touched her forehead. Still hot, but maybe not as hot as before. Maybe. She asked Ren how she felt. Ren said everything hurt, but she was thirsty. Nessa laughed and the sound was half sob. She gave her water, then more broth. Ren drank it all. By morning, the fever had broken. It would take another week before Ren was strong enough to stand. But she was alive. She was going to survive. That night after Ren fell asleep, Nessa sat with her hand resting on Ghost's head. The wolf dog's eyes were closed, but its ears twitched at every sound. Thank you, Nessa whispered. Ghost's tail thumped once against the stone floor. After the sickness, Nessa rebuilt everything. She reinforced the wind wall with stones and packed mud until it was nearly 2 feet thick. She added a second layer inside with a 6-inch air gap between the walls. Dead air, Edmund Brennan had written, is the best insulator God ever made. She built a proper door from woven branches sealed with pine pitch. She dug a food cache in the back of the cave where the temperature held steady at 40 degrees. The cave didn't look like a cave anymore. It looked like a home. Ren started drawing again. Not the dark pictures from Cordell's house. Pictures of their life. 2 girls by a fire. A gray wolf dog with pale eyes. Rabbits in the snow. She drew them on the cave walls with charcoal sticks, right next to Edmund Brennan's marks from 1889 and the ancient drawings from people whose names would never be known. Their marks added to the story of this place. Layer upon layer. Life upon life. Then February came, and with it the storm that would test everything. Ghost knew before they did. 3 days before the blizzard hit, the wolf dog became restless, pacing, growling at the sky, refusing to move more than a few feet from Ren. Nessa watched its behavior and remembered Brennan's journal. Before the worst storms, the animals know. The birds go silent. The deer move to lower ground. Listen to them. She began preparing, gathered every piece of firewood she could carry, stacking it to the ceiling, reinforced the wall, filled the food cache, sealed every crack she could find. On February 14th, the sky turned yellow. Not sunset yellow. A sickly, jaundiced color that pressed down on the mountains like a weight. The air went perfectly still. Even the birds had stopped singing. That night, the blizzard hit like a wall. Wind and snow slamming into the mountain with the force of something that wanted to tear the world apart. The sound was like nothing Nessa had ever heard. A howling, shrieking roar that came from everywhere at once. Snow piled against the entrance so fast that by morning they were sealed inside. Nessa dug a ventilation hole just wide enough to breathe. The cold that rushed in was unlike anything she had felt. It drove into her skin like needles of ice. The thermometer Edmund Brennan had left near the entrance read 47 degrees below zero. Without wind chill. The blizzard lasted 9 days. 9 days of darkness. 9 days of rationing every scrap of food. 9 days of burning wood as slowly as possible. 9 days of sleeping in shifts so the fire never went out. Outside, the temperature dropped to 62 below with wind chill. Later, Nessa would learn that this storm killed 67 people across 4 counties. Farmers with decades of experience, hunters who knew the mountains, adults with warm houses and full cellars and every advantage 2 orphan girls did not have. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 38 degrees. The double wall worked. The air gap trapped heat. The stone absorbed warmth from the fire during the day and released it at night. Everything Nessa had built, everything Astrid had taught, everything Brennan had written, it held. On the 7th day, Nessa did something she had never done. She prayed. She didn't know if anyone was listening, but in the darkness, with the wind screaming outside, and her sister sleeping by the fire, and a wolf dog pressed against them both, she closed her eyes. Please, she thought, not for me, for Ren. Let her see spring. On the 9th day, the wind began to die. Nessa dug them out into a world transformed. Snow drifted higher than her head. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The forest looked like a battlefield. But the sky was clear and the air no longer tried to kill them. Ren appeared beside her, Ghost at her heels. We made it, Ren said. Nessa put her arm around her sister and felt tears freeze on her cheeks. Yes, she said. We made it. March arrived slowly. The days grew longer. Icicles formed at the cave entrance, dripping in the afternoon sun. One morning, Ren stood at the entrance and sniffed the air. It smells different, she said. Nessa listened. Somewhere distant, water was running. Ice was melting. Spring was beginning to remember itself. She looked at their cave, the wind wall they had built together, the drawings on the walls, Ghost sleeping by the cold fire pit. 94 days in the wilderness, starvation, sickness, the worst storm in 50 years. They had faced all of it. They had won. Then one afternoon in late March, Ghost started barking. Not the low growl he used for predators. A sharp, alert bark Nessa had never heard before. He was staring down the slope toward the creek that had emerged from under the melting ice. 2 figures were climbing toward them, a man and a woman. Hiking clothes, fishing poles. The woman saw Nessa first. She stopped mid-stride. Her mouth fell open. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the woman spoke, barely above a whisper. Oh my God, are you real? Her name was Marlene Calder. She was 50 years old, a former Army nurse who had served in the Pacific during the war. Her husband Harlan was a retired forest ranger. They lived in Darby, 20 miles south, and they had come to their favorite fishing spot to celebrate the thaw. They had not expected to find 2 children living in a cave. Nessa didn't trust them. She stood with her stone knife visible, Ghost growling at her feet, and answered their questions in short, flat sentences. How long had they been here? Since December. Where were their parents? Dead. Who brought them here? Their aunt. Where was their aunt now? Gone. Marlene's face moved through a dozen emotions. Shock. Horror. And then something quieter. Something that looked like recognition. She crouched down to Nessa's eye level. She didn't reach for her, didn't try to touch her or hold her or tell her everything would be fine. She just looked at her with steady brown eyes and said something that cracked open a fissure in the wall Nessa had built around herself. My parents left me at an orphanage when I was 9. They didn't want me either." Nessa stared at her. Something shifted in her chest. A tiny fracture in stone she had believed was solid. Marlene didn't push. She asked if she could see the cave. Nessa hesitated, then stepped aside. Marlene walked in slowly, reverently, the way you enter a place where something sacred has happened. She looked at the wind wall, the sleeping platform, the shelves carved into stone, the food cache, the drawings on the walls, 2 girls by a fire, a wolf dog, mountains and stars. When she came back out, there were tears on her face. "You built all of this?" Nessa nodded. Marlene turned to Harlan. "Go back to town," she said. "Get the sheriff. Bring food. Lots of food." Then she sat down on a rock at the cave entrance. Nessa asked what she was doing. Marlene said she was staying, if it was all right with Nessa. She would wait here until help arrived. She didn't want them to be alone anymore. Ren had been watching from inside the cave. She came out slowly, ghost behind her. She looked at Marlene for a long time with those wide, serious eyes. "Do you have any candy?" Marlene laughed, and the sound was half a sob. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a slightly crushed chocolate bar. Ren looked at Nessa, waiting for permission. Because even after everything they had survived, even after 94 days of making her own decisions, Ren still looked to her older sister first. "It's okay," Nessa said. "You can have it." Ren bit into the chocolate, and her face transformed. Pure, bright, uncomplicated joy spreading across her features like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. "I forgot what this tasted like," she whispered. Marlene put her hand over her mouth. She was crying openly, not from sadness, from something larger than sadness, something that didn't have a name. Harlan returned 4 hours later with the sheriff and 3 men carrying blankets and food and warm clothes. They brought a wagon to carry the girls to town. But before they left, Nessa asked for a moment. She walked back into the cave one last time. She looked at the fire pit where they had cooked their meals, the platform where they had slept pressed together for warmth, the drawings Ren had made on the wall, 2 small figures standing next to the ancient marks, their story layered over the stories of everyone who had come before. She reached out and touched the cold stone. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she turned and walked out into the spring sunlight. And for the first time in 94 days, she did not look back at the cave to make sure it was still there. She didn't need to. She was carrying everything it had given her. But what Nessa didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly have known as the wagon carried them down the mountain toward Darby and the life that waited for them there, was that surviving the wilderness had been the easy part. The town would be harder. The people would be harder. And the woman who had just held her while she cried, the woman who said she understood, the woman whose eyes were so full of kindness that Nessa almost let herself believe in it. That woman was keeping a secret about Nessa's parents, about the night they died, about what Marlene Calder knew and didn't say and had been carrying in silence for 2 long years. The mountain had tested Nessa's body. The town was about to test something far more fragile, her ability to trust. The news spread through Darby like a brush fire in dry grass. 2 girls, survivors, living in a cave all winter. By the time the wagon reached the edge of town, a crowd had gathered along the main street. People stared from porches and storefronts. They whispered behind their hands. They pointed at the two thin figures huddled together in the back of the wagon, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of cedar and someone else's house. Nessa kept her arm around Ren and her eyes straight ahead. Ghost walked alongside the wagon, his pale eyes scanning every face, a low growl vibrating in his chest whenever someone stepped too close. The whispers started before the wheels stopped turning. Lorna Maddox was the first to speak loud enough for others to hear. She stood outside the general store, with her arms crossed, watching the wagon approach the way a woman watches a stray dog wandering too close to her garden. "Two children surviving a Montana winter in a cave," she said, shaking her head. Impossible. Someone must have been helping them. Some drifter living in the woods. Lord knows what really happened up there. Lorna Maddox was 58 years old, wife of the town councilman, head of the church ladies' committee, chairwoman of every charity drive, every bake sale, every community decision that mattered. She had lived in Darby her entire life, and she understood something about small towns that newcomers never did. Order was everything. Routine was safety. And strangers, especially strangers with strange stories, were a threat to both. Her words reached half the town by evening. By the following morning, they had hardened into something that felt almost like fact. The sheriff, a heavy man named Vernon Haskell, took the girls to the town hall for questioning. He was polite. He offered them water and sandwiches. But his questions had a sharpness to them, a careful skepticism, as if he expected to catch them in a lie they hadn't told yet. "Nobody survives a winter in a cave," he said. "Not alone. Not children." Nessa met his eyes. "We did." The town doctor, a thin, precise man named Edmund Fairchild, examined them next. He checked their temperatures, listened to their hearts, inspected their fingers and toes for frostbite. There wasn't any. He shook his head slowly and said he couldn't explain it. "Medically speaking," he said, "this shouldn't be possible. The caloric requirements alone, the exposure risk, the psychological strain." Nessa said nothing. She had learned in Cordell's house that explaining yourself to people who had already decided not to believe you was a waste of breath. But not everyone in Darby was skeptical, and not everyone was unkind. Marlene Calder visited every day. She brought food, books, small gifts for Ren, colored pencils and drawing paper, and a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing that she said had belonged to her when she was a girl. Ren accepted everything with quiet, wide-eyed gratitude. She drew pictures of Marlene. Marlene by the fire. Marlene holding Ghost's leash. Marlene laughing at something Ren had said. The drawings were full of color again. That alone told Nessa something important. Harlan Calder spent hours talking to Nessa about the wilderness. He asked real questions and listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention she had only ever received from her grandmother. He didn't talk down to her. He didn't treat her survival as a curiosity or a trick. He treated it as an achievement. And that small distinction meant more to Nessa than she could say. Then on the third day after their arrival, a man appeared at the boarding house where they were staying. Old, late 70s. White beard trimmed close to his jaw. He walked with a carved wooden cane, but his handshake was strong enough to make Nessa's knuckles ache. His name was Silas Brennan. He asked if she had found the tin box in the cave. Nessa's heart jumped. She nodded. Silas smiled, and the smile changed his whole face, turning it from weathered stone into something warm and lived in. That was my father's journal, he said. Edmund Brennan. He spent 41 days in that cave in 1889. I always wondered if anyone else would find it. You believe us? Nessa asked. Silas looked at her with eyes that had seen more Montana winters than anyone alive in Darby. My father survived that cave, he said. He told me about it every year until the day he died. I know what's possible when you have knowledge and will. He paused. And I know what that cave does for someone who respects it. Then his voice softened. He leaned forward on his cane. There's something else you should know, he said. My father and your grandfather were close friends. They came to Montana together in the same year, 1902. Two young men from Norway chasing the same dream. My father went trapping. Your grandfather went mining. But they stayed close their whole lives. It was my father who introduced your grandfather to your grandmother at the church social in Darby. Without Edmund Brennan, there would be no Astrid and Eric Hollis. There would be no farm, and there would be no you. Nessa stared at him. The cave, the journal, the knowledge that had saved her life. It wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was a thread stretching back half a century, connecting two families through the same mountain, the same winter, the same stubborn refusal to die. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Seeds, he said, vegetables, for your grandmother's farm, when you go back. Nessa's throat tightened. She started to say they might not be able to go back. Silas held up his hand. He said he had heard about their aunt. He said the sheriff was looking into it. He said she shouldn't worry about things that were being handled. Then he introduced the young man, standing quietly behind him. This is my grandson, he said. Coulter. Coulter Brennan was in his late 20s, tall, quiet. He had his grandfather's strong jaw but softer eyes, brown where Silas's were gray. He worked as a carpenter and volunteer forest ranger. He held his hat in his hands and nodded at Nessa and said it was good to meet her. That was all. 4 words, but he said them like he meant everyone. Then Ghost stepped out from behind Nessa's legs. Coulter went still. He stared at the wolf dog for a long moment. Then he dropped to one knee, slowly, the way you move around an animal you don't want to frighten. He reached out and parted the matted fur around Ghost's neck. His fingers found the leather collar. He turned it until the carved letters faced upward. Brennan. Coulter looked up at his grandfather. His face had changed. The quiet composure was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded. Grandpa, he said, this is Ranger. This is your dog. Silas's cane trembled in his grip. He lowered himself carefully and held out his hand. Ghost sniffed his fingers. Then the wolf dog's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then harder, his whole body swaying with it. He pressed his head against Silas's palm and made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a whine and not quite a bark. It was the sound of recognition. Silas's eyes were wet. He looked up at Nessa. I raised him from a pup, he said. Named him Ranger. He ran off 2 winters ago during a storm. I searched for months. I thought he was dead. He scratched behind the wolf dog's ears. The animal leaned into his hand with his eyes half closed. He found his way back to the cave, Silas said softly. The same cave where my father survived. The same cave where he used to follow me as a pup when I would hike up there to read my father's journal. He went home, the only home he knew besides mine. Nessa looked at Ghost, at Ranger, at the animal who had walked into their cave during the worst storm of the winter and stayed, who had kept Ren warm through her fever, who had positioned himself between her sister and the darkness every single night. "He didn't find us by accident," she said. "No," Silas agreed. "I don't believe he did." Nessa barely looked at Coulter after that. She was not in the business of trusting people she didn't know. She had learned that lesson in Cordell Pratt's house, and she had carved it into herself the way Edmund Brennan had carved his notes into the cave wall, deep enough that nothing could wear it away. Over the following weeks, Nessa and Ren settled into an uneasy routine. The boarding house was warm and the food was plentiful, and for the first time in months, they slept in real beds. But Darby was not a place that accepted strangers easily, and Lorna Maddox made sure of it. Lorna didn't shout. She didn't make accusations in public. She operated the way weather operates, slowly and steadily, and from a direction you weren't watching. She spoke to the pastor about the unusual survival methods the girls described. Almost pagan, she suggested. She mentioned to the shopkeeper's wife that nobody really knew where these children came from, or what kind of people their parents had been. She pointed out to the church committee that Marlene Calder seemed awfully attached to two strangers, and wasn't that just a little bit odd for a woman who kept to herself most of the year? One by one, doors that might have opened began to stay shut. The school teacher who had offered to tutor Ren suddenly found her schedule full. The woman who ran the boarding house started leaving their breakfast on a tray outside their door instead of inviting them to eat in the dining room. Small changes, almost invisible, but Nessa felt every one of them the way you feel. A change in the wind before you see the clouds. She said nothing about it. She had survived worse than cold shoulders and closed doors. But she watched Ren notice it too, watched her sister's brightness dim by one shade, and then another, and something hard and hot began building in her chest. Meanwhile, the investigation into Cordell Pratt was moving forward. Slowly. Marlene drove to Missoula herself. She knocked on doors. She asked questions the sheriff hadn't thought to ask. She found the feed store owner who remembered Cordell asking about remote mountain roads where nobody goes. She found the widow who had seen the wagon leave town with 3 passengers and return with 1. And in Cordell's study, hidden in a locked drawer, she found a letter to a lawyer dated 2 days before the girls disappeared. The letter inquired about selling property belonging to minor children who were no longer in her care. Marlene brought everything to Sheriff Haskell. She spread it across his desk like evidence at a trial. "Tell me again," she said, "that those girls ran away." The sheriff stared at the papers for a long moment. Then he reached for his hat. During those weeks, Nessa visited the farm twice. The court had granted her supervised visits with Harlan as escort. The house was dusty and quiet, but the structure was sound. The fields were wild with weeds, but the soil was dark and rich. Ghost ran through the rooms, sniffing every corner, tail wagging for the first time since they had left the cave. On the second visit, Coulter Brennan was there. He had come without being asked. He was replacing 3 fence posts that had rotted through over the winter. He worked in silence, driving the new posts into the ground with steady, even strokes. When Nessa came out onto the porch, he stopped and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Grandfather asked me to check the fencing," he said. "Didn't want the deer getting into the garden before you had a chance to plant." Nessa stood on the porch and watched him work. She didn't thank him. She didn't know how to thank someone for something she hadn't asked for. But she didn't tell him to leave either. And when Ren ran across the yard and tugged on his sleeve and asked him to come look at a bird's nest she had found in the barn, Coulter set down his tools and followed her without hesitation. Nessa watched them walking across the yard together, Ren chattering, Coulter listening with his head tilted slightly to one side, Ghost trotting between them. Something turned over in her chest. She pushed it down. That evening back at the boarding house, Nessa found something in her grandmother's room that she had missed on previous visits. A wooden box under the bed. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All written in Astrid's careful hand. Some addressed and stamped, but never mailed. Some half-finished, and one, near the bottom, that stopped Nessa's breath. It was addressed to Marlene Calder, dated 3 weeks before Astrid died. If something happens to me, the letter read, please find my girls. I am afraid of what Cordell will do. She has written to lawyers. She has asked questions about the farm. I do not trust her. I have no one else to ask. You know what happened. You carry it too. Please do not let my granddaughters pay for our silence. Nessa read it 3 times. Each time the words hit harder. You know what happened. You carry it too. Our silence. She looked at the letter for a long time. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and the light in the room was turning the color of old gold. Ghost lay at her feet. Ren was asleep in the next room. Everything was quiet. But inside Nessa's chest, something was beginning to crack. A fracture line running through the foundation of something she had been building without realizing it. Trust. In Marlene. In the idea that someone in this world might care about her without wanting something in return. Our silence. What silence? What did Marlene know? She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark with the letter pressed against her chest and listened to Ren breathing and tried to convince herself that there was an innocent explanation. That the words didn't mean what they seemed to mean. That the woman who had found them in the mountains and held Ren while she cried and brought them food every single day was not hiding something terrible. But Nessa Hollis was a girl who watched everything and remembered everything. And she already knew the answer. 3 days later, she walked to Marlene's house on the south end of town. It was early afternoon. Harlan was out on a supply run. The house was small and neatly kept with a garden along the fence and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Marlene opened the door and smiled when she saw Nessa. The smile faded when she saw what Nessa was holding. Nessa set the letter on the kitchen table between them. Marlene looked at it. Her face drained of color. She sat down slowly in the wooden chair as though her legs had forgotten how to hold her. You knew my grandmother, Nessa said. Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice she used when she was trying very hard not to feel anything at all. Marlene closed her eyes. Yes, you knew her before she died. You visited her. She wrote to you. Yes. Then tell me what this means. Tell me what you know. Tell me what happened. Marlene opened her eyes. They were wet. Her hands were trembling on the table, the fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. She looked at Nessa, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall. Ghost sat at Nessa's feet with his ears forward, watching. Then Marlene began to talk. She told Nessa that she had known Astrid for 6 years. They had met at the church in town. Astrid had come to sell preserves at the autumn market, and Marlene had bought 3 jars of lingonberry jam, and they had talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. They became friends. Unlikely ones. Astrid, the Norwegian immigrant who lived alone on a mountain farm. Marlene, the war nurse who had come home from the Pacific with nightmares she never discussed, and a husband who understood without asking. Then Marlene said something that changed everything. "I was there the night your parents died." The words landed in the kitchen like stones dropped into still water. Nessa felt her body go rigid. Her fingers curled into fists on her lap. Marlene kept talking. Her voice was low and unsteady, but she did not stop. There had been heavy rain that autumn. The mountain above the Hollis farm had been unstable for weeks. The county surveyor had filed a report warning of landslide risk along the North Ridge. The report was sent to the town council. The council was supposed to issue warnings to residents in the affected area. Marlene paused. She pressed her hands flat against the table. The report crossed Harlan's desk. He was working part-time for the county then. He flagged it as urgent. He passed it up to the council office, and it sat there, on a desk, for 11 days. Because the councilman responsible for that district was away on business, and his wife, Lorna Maddox, who handled his correspondence while he traveled, decided the report wasn't urgent enough to forward. Nessa felt the room tilt. "The landslide came on a Tuesday night," Marlene said. "Your parents were home. Astrid was in town that evening visiting me. She was going to drive back that night, but the rain was so heavy I convinced her to stay. She stayed, and her daughter and son-in-law died under 1,000 tons of mud and rock while she sat in my kitchen drinking tea." Marlene's voice broke. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Tears ran down her cheeks. "She survived because of me," Marlene whispered. "And they died because a piece of paper sat on the wrong desk for 11 days. And I knew. Harlan told me about the report. He told me it had been sent to the council. After the landslide, I put the pieces together. I knew that Lorna Maddox had that warning in her hands, and she didn't pass it on. I knew, and I said nothing." "Why?" Nessa asked. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like something coming from very far away. Marlene looked at her. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Lorna's husband controls half the jobs in this county. Harlan would have lost his position. We would have lost our house, and your grandmother asked me not to. She said it wouldn't bring them back. She said the grief was enough without adding a war she didn't have the strength to fight. So I stayed silent, and the silence has been eating me alive ever since." She reached across the table toward Nessa's hand. Nessa pulled away. The motion was sharp and sudden, and it made Marlene flinch as though she had been struck. "You knew," Nessa said. "You knew what happened to my parents. You knew Lorna Maddox could have prevented it. You knew all of this, and you smiled at me, and brought me food, and let me trust you, and you never said a word." Her voice was rising now. The control was cracking. Underneath it was something vast and dark and old. The same thing she had felt in Cordell's study when she found the lawyer's letter. The same betrayal. The same sickening drop in her stomach. Different face. Same fall. "You're just like her," Nessa said. "You're just like Cordell. You just want to feel less guilty." Marlene shook her head. "That's not true. Everyone lies to me," Nessa said. "Everyone says they care." and then I find out what they really want. Cordell wanted the farm. You want forgiveness. Neither of you ever wanted me." She stood up so fast the chair fell backward and hit the floor. Ghost was on his feet instantly, ears flat, looking between Nessa and Marlene as though trying to decide where the danger was. Nessa walked to the door. Marlene called her name. Nessa did not turn around. She walked back to the boarding house in the last light of the afternoon. The mountains were black against a sky that was turning from orange to purple. She could hear the creek running somewhere in the dark below the road. She could hear her own breathing, harsh and ragged, the breathing of someone trying very hard not to scream. She locked the door of her room. She sat on the bed. Ren was at the Brennan house, drawing with Silas, safe for the evening. Nessa was alone. Ghost had not followed her. When she left Marlene's house, the wolf dog had stayed. He sat at Marlene's feet and watched Nessa walk away, and did not move. That small betrayal cut deeper than anything else. The animal she had fed and sheltered and trusted with her sister's life had chosen someone else. The way everyone always chose someone else. The way Cordell chose money over family. The way Lorna Maddox chose convenience over two lives. The way Marlene chose silence over truth. Nessa sat in the dark room, and for the first time since arriving in Darby, she wanted to leave. Pack a bag, take Ren, walk out of this town, and never come back. Let the farm rot. Let them all rot. She had survived a mountain. She could survive anything. She didn't need anyone. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. She needed someone. Ren needed someone. That was the trap. You could build walls thick enough to stop the wind and the snow and the cold, but you couldn't build a wall thick enough to stop needing other people. And the moment you stopped building walls was the moment they could hurt you. 2 days passed. Nessa avoided Marlene. She avoided Coulter. She avoided everyone except Ren, who looked at her with confused, worried eyes and asked why they couldn't visit Marlene anymore. Nessa said they just couldn't right now. On the second evening, Ren came to her with a piece of paper. She had drawn something at Silas's house. It was a picture of Marlene sitting alone at a kitchen table. Her head was in her hands. And underneath, in Ren's careful 7-year-old handwriting, it said, "She cries every night, like you did in the cave." Nessa stared at the drawing for a long time. Then the storm came. Not the slow-building kind that gave you days to prepare, a fast, violent squall that dropped out of the mountains like a fist. Wind tore shingles from roofs. Rain flooded the lower streets. And at the Calder property on the south end of town, the old barn collapsed under the weight of a fallen pine tree. Harlan was inside. He made it out, but his arm was broken, and his ribs were cracked, and the livestock were scattered, and the fence was down, and Marlene was trying to handle all of it alone in the pouring rain. Nessa heard about it from the boarding house owner. She stood at the window watching the storm and felt two things at once: the pull to go and the push to stay. The old reflex that said trust no one, and the newer, quieter voice that said this is what it looks like when someone needs help the way you needed help. She put on her coat and walked out into the rain. She didn't knock. She walked through the broken gate and across the muddy yard and started lifting fence posts out of the water. Marlene came around the side of the house and saw her and stopped. Rain was running down both their faces. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the work wouldn't say better. They fixed the fence together in the dark. They rounded up the chickens. They dragged the fallen branch off the barn roof. Nessa's hands were raw and bleeding, and she didn't care. When it was done, they stood in the yard, soaked through, breathing hard. Marlene said her name. Just her name. Nessa. Nothing else. Nessa didn't answer, but she didn't leave. The next morning, she learned what Lorna Maddox had done while the storm was still raging. Lorna had filed a petition with the county court requesting an emergency review of the Calder guardianship application. The petition argued that Marlene Calder had concealed material information about the Hollis family and was therefore unfit to serve as guardian. If the petition succeeded, Nessa and Ren would be removed from Marlene's care and placed in a state orphanage. Separately, the petition bore the signatures of 4 church committee members. Lorna had collected them during the storm, going door to door while the wind howled and the rain drove sideways through the streets, while Marlene was pulling her husband from a collapsed barn, while Nessa was lifting fence posts in the dark. Nessa read the petition in the sheriff's office. Her hands were steady. Her face was still. But inside, something had shifted. Not toward trust. Not yet. Something harder than trust and more dangerous. Toward a decision. She had spent her whole life being acted upon. Cordell had acted upon her. The wilderness had acted upon her. Lorna Maddox was acting upon her now. And every time, Nessa's response had been the same. Survive. Endure. Build walls. Keep the fire burning, and wait for the storm to pass. But some storms don't pass. Some storms are made by people who will keep making them until someone stands in their path and says no more. Nessa set the petition down on the sheriff's desk. She looked at Vernon Haskell and asked when the hearing was scheduled. Friday, the sheriff said. 3 days from now. Nessa nodded once. Then she walked out of the office and into the pale morning light and began preparing for a different kind of survival. The hearing was held in the town hall on a Friday morning in April. The room was small and plain. Wooden benches. A table at the front where the county judge sat with the petition spread before him. Windows along one wall let in pale spring light that made everything look washed out and tired. Lorna Maddox sat in the front row. She wore her best dress and her church face, the one that communicated concern and civic duty and absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing. Behind her sat the 4 women who had signed the petition. They kept their eyes forward and their hands folded in their laps. Marlene sat on the other side of the room. Harlan was beside her, his broken arm in a sling, his cracked ribs taped beneath his shirt. He had insisted on coming. He sat upright and still, the way men of his generation sat when they were in pain and refused to show it. Marlene's face was calm, but her hands were shaking in her lap. Nessa sat in the back row with Ren beside her. Ren held her drawing pad against her chest like a shield. Ghost lay at their feet, his chin on his paws, his pale eyes tracking every person who entered the room. The judge called the hearing to order. He read the petition aloud. The language was careful and precise and devastating. It alleged that Marlene Calder had a prior relationship with the deceased Astrid Hollis, that she had knowledge of circumstances surrounding the death of Nessa's parents, that she had concealed this information from the court during her guardianship application, that this pattern of concealment demonstrated a fundamental lack of trustworthiness incompatible with the responsibility of caring for minor children. Lorna was invited to speak first. She stood and smoothed her dress and addressed the judge with the practiced confidence of a woman who had chaired 100 meetings and won every one. She expressed deep concern for the welfare of the children. She praised the community's generosity in welcoming the girls. She acknowledged the remarkable nature of their survival. But she questioned whether placing them in a home built on secrets was truly in their best interest. "The girls deserve stability," she said. "They deserve honesty. They have already been failed by one adult who put her own interests above theirs. I am asking this court to ensure it does not happen again." She sat down. The room was silent. Several people in the back rows nodded. The judge looked at Marlene. He asked if she wished to respond. Marlene began to stand. But before she could speak, Nessa was already on her feet. The room turned. Every head, every pair of eyes. A 15-year-old girl in a borrowed dress standing in the back row of a county hearing with a wolf dog at her feet and her 7-year-old sister clutching her hand. The judge studied her. He asked if she wished to address the court. Nessa said yes. He told her to come forward. She walked to the front of the room. She did not hurry. She did not look at Lorna Maddox. She looked at the judge. A tired man in his 60s who had probably heard 1,000 petitions and forgotten most of them. She told him her name. She told him she was 15 years old. She told him that 5 months ago, her aunt drove her and her sister into the Bitterroot Mountains and left them in a clearing in the snow with 2 pieces of bread and a half-empty bottle of water and drove away. She told him about the cave, about the wind wall she built at 60 degrees because her grandmother taught her that angle traps the most dead air, about the sleeping platform and the snares and the fire she kept burning for 94 days with a brass lighter that had belonged to her grandfather in Norway, about ghosts appearing in a storm and staying, about her sister's fever and the bone broth and the 9-day blizzard that killed 67 people across 4 counties. She told him all of this in a quiet, steady voice. No tears, no drama, just facts laid out one after another like stones in a wall. Then she stopped. She took a breath. "I know what Mrs. Maddox wrote in that petition," she said. "She says Marlene Calder kept secrets. She's right. Marlene knew my grandmother. She knew things about how my parents died. She didn't tell me." Nessa paused. The room was absolutely still. "When I found out I was angry," she said, "I was so angry I couldn't see straight. Because I have been lied to by every adult who was supposed to take care of me. My aunt lied. She smiled at us and bought us dresses. And then she drove us into the mountains to die. So when I found out Marlene was keeping something from me, I thought she was the same. I thought everyone was the same. I thought trust was just another word for the moment before someone hurts you." She looked at Marlene for the first time. Marlene's face was wet. Her hands were still shaking. "But I was wrong," Nessa said. "My aunt lied to take something from us. Marlene lied because she was afraid of losing something. Those aren't the same thing. My grandmother forgave her a long time ago. She wrote it in her journal. She wrote that Marlene carried the guilt worse than anyone, and that punishing her would be like punishing someone for being human." She turned back to the judge. "I am 15 years old," she said. "I have no parents. I have no family except my sister and a wolf dog and a woman who drove to Missoula by herself and knocked on doors until she found the proof that our aunt tried to kill us. A woman who sat on a rock outside a cave and said she didn't want us to be alone anymore. A woman who made mistakes and carried them and told me the truth when I asked, even though she knew I might never forgive her. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry, but something in the room had shifted. The air itself felt different, heavier, more honest. I'm not asking this court to pretend Marlene Calder is perfect, Nessa said. I'm asking this court to understand that perfect people don't exist. My grandmother wasn't perfect. She kept secrets too, but she kept me alive with knowledge and love and stubbornness, and that is enough. Marlene Calder is enough. She looked at Lorna Maddox for the first time. Lorna's face had gone rigid. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but her eyes had changed. Something in them had cracked, just slightly, the way ice cracks in spring when the water underneath begins to move. Nessa spoke directly to her. I know you're afraid of us, she said. I know strangers are hard for a town like this. I know you think you're protecting something, but I also know that a county report about landslide risk sat on your husband's desk for 11 days. And I know that if someone had passed that report along, my parents might still be alive. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight and texture and feels like it might never end. Nessa held Lorna's gaze. She did not raise her voice. She did not point or accuse. She simply stood there, a girl who had survived a mountain, looking at a woman who had built her life on never being questioned. I'm not here to punish you for that, Nessa said. I'm not here to punish anyone. I have spent 5 months fighting to stay alive, and I am tired of fighting. I just want to go home. I want my sister to go to school. I want to plant my grandmother's garden. And I want to stop being afraid that the next person who is kind to me is going to turn out to be lying. She paused. So I am asking you, all of you, to let me stop being afraid. Let us stay. She walked back to her seat. Ren grabbed her hand and held it with both of hers. Ghost pressed against her leg. The room stayed silent for a long time. The judge cleared his throat. He looked at the petition. He looked at Lorna Maddox. He looked at Marlene. He looked at the 2 girls in the back row. Then he denied the petition. Guardianship proceedings would continue as scheduled. After the hearing, the room emptied slowly. People filed out without speaking. Some of them looked at Nessa as they passed. Not with suspicion this time, with something else, something quieter and harder to name. Lorna Maddox was the last to stand. She gathered her papers. She walked toward the door. Then she stopped beside Nessa's bench. She didn't look at her directly. She looked at the wall above her head, the way people do when they are trying to say something that costs them more than they expected. I didn't know they had children, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. When that report came across the desk, I didn't know there were children in that house. Then she walked out. Nessa found Marlene in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall, her face in her hands. Harlan stood beside her with his good arm around her shoulders. Nessa stopped in front of them. Marlene looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen. They stood there looking at each other. The hallway was empty. The light came through a window at the far end, pale and clean. Grandmother forgave you a long time ago, Nessa said. Her voice cracked for the first time all morning. And so do I. Marlene made a sound that was not quite a word. She reached for Nessa, and this time Nessa did not pull away. She stepped forward into the embrace and felt Marlene's arms close around her and felt the woman's whole body shaking with something that had been held in for 2 years. Marlene whispered into her hair, "My girl, my brave girl." It was the first time anyone had called her that since her grandmother died. Nessa closed her eyes and let herself be held. Cordell Pratt was arrested on a Tuesday morning in Missoula. The sheriff drove up with 2 deputies and a warrant that listed charges no one in Darby had ever seen attached to a woman who wore leather gloves and attended the opera, attempted murder by abandonment, child endangerment, fraud. She denied everything. She said the girls had run away. She said she had searched for them for days. But the evidence was stacked against her like cordwood. The feed store owner who remembered her asking about remote roads. The widow who saw 3 people leave and 1 come back. The letter to the lawyer about selling property belonging to children no longer in her care. The bundle of bread and water, still partially frozen, that Nessa had kept in the cave as proof. The trial lasted less than a week. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Cordell stood in the courtroom with her face blank and her pale eyes empty and did not look at the 2 girls sitting in the 3rd row. The judge sentenced her to 15 years. She was led away in handcuffs without a word. Ren leaned close to Nessa. "Are we safe now?" Nessa squeezed her hand. "Yes, we're safe." But safety was not a feeling that arrived all at once. It came slowly over the weeks that followed, the way spring came to the Bitterroot Valley that year, in small signs, quiet changes, things you might miss if you weren't paying attention. The first sign was Lorna Maddox. 3 days after the hearing, a basket appeared on the porch of the boarding house. No note, no name. Just a basket filled with preserves and fresh bread and a jar of honey from someone's private hive. Nessa knew who had left it. She recognized the cloth that lined the basket. The same pattern Lorna had worn at the hearing. A week later, Lorna appeared at the farm. Nessa was pulling weeds in the front garden. Ren was drawing on the porch, and Ghost was lying in a patch of sunlight with his tongue out. Lorna stood at the gate for a long moment before Nessa noticed her. She was holding a folder of papers. "The county council has approved a historical preservation easement for your property," Lorna said. Her voice was stiff and formal, the voice of a woman who had spent her life giving orders and was now doing something unfamiliar with it. "The easement means the land can't be developed or sold to developers. It protects the farm and the surrounding acreage in perpetuity." Nessa wiped the dirt from her hands. She looked at Lorna. Lorna did not look away, though it clearly cost her something to hold the gaze. "I pushed the paperwork through the council myself," Lorna said. "It was the least I could do." She set the folder on the gate post. Then she looked at Ren on the porch. Ren was watching her with those wide, serious eyes that missed nothing. Lorna's expression shifted. Something moved behind the careful mask she wore. Something old and heavy that she had been carrying long enough for it to have worn grooves in her. "She's a good artist," Lorna said quietly. "Your sister." Then she turned and walked back down the road. She did not look back, but she walked slower than she needed to. And Nessa understood that some apologies don't come in words. They come in the things people do when they think no one is watching closely enough to notice. The farm came back to life in pieces. Silas Brennan's seeds went into the ground in late April. Nessa worked the soil the way Astrid had taught her, turning it with a spade, breaking the clods with her hands, feeling the dark earth crumble between her fingers. The first green shoots appeared in May. Ren checked them every morning, running barefoot across the yard to kneel in the dirt and inspect each tiny plant as though it were a miracle she had personally arranged. Coulter came to the farm most weekends. He never announced himself. He simply appeared with his tools and started working on whatever needed fixing. A loose board on the porch, a cracked window frame, a section of roof where the shingles had curled and separated over 2 winters of neglect. He worked quietly and well. He never asked for anything. He never stayed longer than the work required. One Saturday afternoon in early June, he was replacing a broken step on the back porch. Nessa brought out 2 glasses of water and sat on the railing and watched him measure and cut and fit the new board into place. His hands were sure and unhurried. He handled the wood the way her grandmother used to handle bread dough, with patience, with respect for the material. She asked him why he kept coming. He didn't answer right away. He set the hammer down and sat on the step he had just built and looked out at the field where Ren was throwing a stick for Ghost, who retrieved it every time with the solemn dedication of an animal performing sacred duty. "My wife passed 3 years ago," he said. His voice was quiet and steady. She had been sick for a long time. After she was gone, I stopped fixing things, stopped building, stopped doing anything with my hands. My grandfather was the one who told me to start again. He said grief is not a reason to stop making things. He said the best way to honor someone you lost is to build something that lasts. He looked at his hands. They were calloused and scarred and brown from the sun. "I come here because this place needs building," he said, "and because building things is how I remember that I'm still alive." Nessa looked at him. She looked at the field where Ren was laughing at Ghost. She looked at the mountains beyond the fence line, still capped with snow even in June, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. She felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she had been holding tight for so long, she had forgotten it was there. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She sat on the railing, and he sat on the step, and they watched Ren and Ghost run through the tall grass in the late afternoon light, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full. Summer burned golden across the valley. The garden produced more than Nessa expected. Tomatoes and beans and squash and herbs that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen. Marlene came to the farm 3 times a week. She taught Nessa recipes that Astrid had shared with her years ago. Lingonberry jam, brown cheese, potato flatbread cooked on a griddle so hot the edges blackened and curled. The kitchen filled with steam and the smell of butter and flour and something older than either. Something passed down. Ren drew everything. The garden, the kitchen, Marlene's hands kneading dough, Coulter's tools hung on nails in the barn, Ghost sleeping on the porch in a square of sunlight. She filled 3 notebooks that summer and started a 4th. Her drawings were bright again, full of color and warmth and the particular kind of detail that only comes from a child who is paying attention because she finally feels safe enough to look closely at the world around her. In August, the adoption was finalized. Marlene and Harlan Calder became the legal parents of Nessa and Ren Hollis. The ceremony was brief and quiet. The judge signed the papers in his office. Marlene cried. Harlan shook Nessa's hand with his good arm and called her daughter, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that made Nessa's eyes burn. Ren asked if she could still keep the name Hollis. The judge said she could. Ren said good, because she was a Hollis and a Calder, and she wanted to be both. Fall came early that year. The aspens turned gold in September. The air sharpened. The mountain behind the farm took on its winter face, stern and white-capped and watchful. Nessa stood on the porch one October morning and smelled snow coming, the same metallic edge she had smelled a year ago when her grandmother was still alive and the world was still whole. Marlene drove her to the cemetery that afternoon. The grave was on a small hill at the edge of the churchyard, under an aspen tree whose leaves were dropping gold coins onto the grass. The headstone was simple. Astrid Hollis, 1875 to 1947. Beloved grandmother. Nessa knelt in the grass. She placed a jar of lingonberry jam on the stone. She placed a bundle of dried herbs from the garden beside it. Ghost sat next to her, quiet for once, his pale eyes watching the leaves fall. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Zippo. The brass was warm from her body. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long time. Then she flicked it open. The flame appeared, small and steady, burning without flicker in the still October air. I kept the fire burning, she said, just like I promised. She closed the lighter and pressed it against her chest. The metal held her warmth. Above her, the aspen leaves rattled in a breeze she couldn't feel, a sound like quiet applause, like someone far away clapping their hands together softly and saying yes. That's right. That's my girl. Nessa closed her eyes. When she opened them, the light had changed. The sun was lower. The shadows were longer. The mountain was glowing orange and pink in the last of the day. She stood up and brushed the grass from her knees. Ghost rose beside her. Together they walked back down the hill toward the road where the truck was parked, where Ren was waiting in the passenger seat with her drawing pad and her colored pencils, where Marlene had left a thermos of coffee on the dashboard with a note that said, "Drive safe and come home for dinner." Home. The word had changed. It used to mean a place, a farmhouse at the edge of the world. It still meant that. But now it meant something more. It meant the sound of Ren laughing in the garden. It meant Marlene's hands covered in flour. It meant Coulter's hammer striking wood in a steady rhythm on a Saturday afternoon. It meant Ghost's tail thumping against the porch boards when he heard footsteps coming up the road. It meant the people who stayed. Marlene started the truck. Ren asked if they could stop for candy on the way home. Nessa said yes. Ghost stuck his head out the window and let the wind push his ears flat against his skull. The road wound through the valley, golden with aspens, bright with the last fierce light of the year. Behind them, the mountain rose into the evening sky, massive and indifferent. It had never cared, not once, whether they lived or died. But Nessa Hollis cared. And she had learned something in that cave, in that town, in that long, hard year of loss and survival and forgiveness that her grandmother had been trying to teach her all along. Fire is life, but love is what keeps it burning.